Hello everybody, my name is Sarah. This is my International Review Board proposal presentation that will look at the effect of vitamin D deficiency on athletic performance in women marathon runners training in the Northeast. So first we'll take a look at vitamin D and its primary purpose. So its main role is to aid the body in calcium and phosphorus absorption. This in turn makes it an important vitamin when it comes to maintaining bone health. It's actually created photochemically and is synthesized when the skin makes contact with UV radiation. It's also known as the sunshine vitamin, as UV rays generally come from the sun. It has to undergo 2 hydroxylations, one in the liver and one in the kidney, for activation. It's interesting just to take a look at different areas of the country and the ability for a person to adequately synthesize the amount of vitamin D they would need. So as we can see, a youth in San Diego wearing shorts and a t-shirt will take 11 minutes to synthesize the adequate amount of vitamin D, whereas that same youth in Seattle, it takes 44 minutes for them to adequately synthesize vitamin D. This photo is showing midday summer, so as you can see, a youth in Seattle in the wintertime might have a very difficult time adequately synthesizing vitamin D from the UV rays. We can get vitamin D from various foods. There's natural and fortified foods. The natural foods we can get vitamin D from would be fatty fish such as salmon, eggs, various types of mushrooms, as well as cheese. The fortified foods that we can get vitamin D from are milk as well as cereals. And actually the majority of Americans receive their vitamin D through fortified foods. So what happens if we have too much or too little? So too little vitamin D would result in a deficiency in where the serum 25-OHD levels in the blood are less than 20 nanograms per milliliter. In children, this could cause a disease known as rickets, which is a failure of the bone tissue to properly mineralize and commonly results in bowed legs. In older adults with a vitamin D deficiency, they would be suffering from osteomalacia or osteoporosis, in which they have weak bones and even structural deterioration of the bones, and can be a very painful disease. In toxicity, it's rare, but it can happen in which a person would be suffering from hypercalcemia. So before I talk about my proposal, I'd like to go over a few things that I've reviewed in past literature and past studies. There's been a lot of correlation related to vitamin D and athletics. There's some interesting aspects that people have studied have been vitamin D and its relation to the respiratory system, the musculoskeletal health, as well as actually mood in ultramarathon runners. Some conclusions that have been made regarding vitamin D in athletics have been that vitamin D deficient athletes present significantly smaller cardiac structural parameters than sufficient athletes. Athletes that receive vitamin D supplementation demonstrate a significant increase in VO2 max and an increase in 25-OHD concentrations. Athletes with a deficient or an insufficient 25-OHD concentration can achieve a sufficient 25-OHD concentration within 3 months by taking 2200 IU per day. There's also been a fair amount of study correlating vitamin D athletics as well as training location. And it's been proven that athletes that are training in a southern climate, such as Florida or Australia, are actually able to synthesize vitamin D year-round. All right, so we'll look at my IRB proposal, and the purpose, as mentioned on the first slide, is to determine if a vitamin D deficiency is performance limiting amongst female athletes training to run a marathon in New Jersey over a 6-month time period. The hypothesis is that a vitamin D deficiency is performance limiting in women athletes. So just to break it down, who are we looking at? We're looking at female runners between the ages of 18 to 40 training for the New York City Marathon. The training will take place in the state of New Jersey, and the proposed study will take place in the 6 months prior to the New York City Marathon, which commonly occurs in the month of October. So training in New Jersey during those 6 months prior will give the athletes an advantage, as there's adequate vitamin D able to be synthesized through UV rays during that time. So how are we going to measure this? We're going to be looking at serum 25-OHD blood tests, an athletic performance test, a muscle strength test, and a questionnaire. So in order to recruit subjects, it'll occur 3 months prior to the start of the study, and the subject pool will primarily consist of the women athletes that have a prior history of participation in the New York City Marathon. All subjects will give written consent prior to their initial testing, and the initial testing will include a blood test, which measures their current 25-OHD levels, a skin fold test, which is primarily utilized to assess body composition as well as BMI, and then a questionnaire. The questionnaire will, at this point and throughout the study, is really utilized to measure compliance amongst the athletes participating. Just to take a look at the numbers, so there will be 275 participants in this study, and this number was calculated through a G-Power test, but I also think it's interesting to take a look at the statistics that were published from the 2018 New York City Marathon. So in that marathon, there were 52,800 finishers, 22,000 or so were women, about 11,500 were women between the ages of 18 and 40, and about 1,264 women were from the state of New Jersey. So as you can see, we do have an adequate pool of people to pull for this study. So the runners that initially tested in the deficient range will be placed on a supplementation plan throughout the study. So they'll be receiving 7,000 IU per day until their 25-OHD levels normalize, in which case they'll be moved down to about 2,200 IU per day. Every 8 weeks, the athletes will be tested. So every 8 weeks, they'll have a blood test completed. They'll complete an athletic performance test, which will be a 5-mile indoor track run, and then they will complete a questionnaire. The location where this testing will take place would be a multi-use facility similar to the Hunterdon Health Center located in New Jersey. This health center is a combination of physical therapy, of a gym, as well as medical offices in order to properly hold all of the, properly complete all of the testing. So the questionnaire will consist of 4 questions. Like I said before, mainly to measure compliance. Have they been taking their prescribed dosage of the 7,000 IU per day for those athletes that have been supplemented? Understanding what forms of sun protection they were using. Also knowing if they've suffered from any injuries that affected training during the past 8 weeks, and what kinds of foods they've been consuming. The injury question really would essentially take out those athletes from the study so that they don't alter the conclusion or the results in any way related to something that was unrelated to the study. So the athletes will be following a marathon training plan throughout the duration of the 6 months. The runs will be tracked through the Map My Run application on each athlete's phone. This is a common example of a marathon training schedule, and so one very similar to what these athletes would be following. So there are some risks associated with this study. Of course, injury, dehydration, and upper respiratory infections are all risks that the athletes could suffer from throughout the duration of the study. That being said, these athletes would most likely be training for the marathon whether they were participating in the study or not, and would also be at risk for injury. Hematoma and venipuncture are also risks associated with the athletes in terms of something that can happen through all the blood testing. That being said, I think that there are a few more benefits in the total study. Athletes get to follow a marathon training plan. They get vitamin D supplementation if necessary, and they also have guidance from a dietitian and medical doctor throughout the entirety of the study. So all the results will be recorded in Excel documents throughout the duration. The deficient athletes and their progress will be closely monitored, and the final conclusions would be made at the very end of the marathon. So confidentiality will be kept amongst all participants, and athletes would have access to their personal file at the very end of the study, and all of the research will be safely stored for the number of years necessary at the conclusion of the study. So during with the results, what they'll be looking at is to compare the different serum 25 OHD levels and compare those numbers with the final athletic performance, as well as the training throughout the study. Expected results would be that the vitamin D deficient athletes would perform at a lesser level the first 2 times that they're monitored, and then the last 2 should be able to perform at the same level or better than those athletes who are sufficient. So there's a lot of further research, I think, that could be conducted based on vitamin D and supplementation, as well as athletics and running. You can play around, I think, with the variations of supplementation. This study in particular looks at women, so looking at men in the same sense. And location and time of year differences would also make an impact. One thing that I found interesting in my studies was the talk of global warming. It could potentially challenge and change past research, as the effect of UV rays are different. So that concludes my presentation on my IRB proposal. Any questions, comments are greatly appreciated, and thank you for listening.